Hey guys, welcome. This video is about AWS AppSync, which is a managed GraphQL offering from AWS. And today we are going to create a simple Angular application that talks to a GraphQL server, which is built on AWS AppSync. And we are going to use Amplify library to send request and receive response from the GraphQL endpoint. As you guys may know, Amplify is a front-end library that makes our life easy to talk to AWS backend resources. So let's get started. Now, before I move on, I want to give a quick introduction to GraphQL API. Now, GraphQL API is quite fast and flexible comparing to REST API. Because unlike REST, in GraphQL, it's the client who decides what data it needs from the server. For example, let's say there's a web page that needs to populate with some data. So the client or the browser decides, okay, these are the data that I have to populate in this page. So server, please give this data to me. So it requests the data in terms of a query from the server, and server will fetch the corresponding data and send it back to the client. So it can easily populate the page. And GraphQL, of course, it operates over HTTP. And unlike REST, guys, we can use fewer HTTP requests to get our job done. Because the client has the handle, know what data it needs and what query it creates to get the data. So the client doesn't need to send bunch of HTTP requests to get whatever the data it needs. For the most part, it will get it in one go with a one request. And in GraphQL, the queries are quite flexible, so it's less code to maintain as well. So let's take example. Now this is a GraphQL query. So in this query, we are basically asking from the GraphQL server, hey GraphQL server, give me this particular user's name and the email address, and also all the blog posts that he has created. So when you send this query to a GraphQL server, you will get a response like this one. So this is a JSON response. Can you see the return data is exactly matching the attributes that the client has requested. For example, here's the user, and here's the user object, and here's the name and the email and the posts. Since the user has multiple posts, so it is returned as an array. So inside this array you have objects, so each object contains title and the body. So how come GraphQL is faster than REST? For example, if it is REST, we may have to get the user's name and the email and the ID first using a one HTTP call to the server, and then we may have to send the user's ID to a different API endpoint to fetch all the posts of that user. So it could be like couple of requests in order to like formulate this type of a data object. But in GraphQL, for the most part, we have only one API endpoint. For that API endpoint, we send the query that we need. So the browser or the client makes this query, and the server will make sure get whatever the corresponding data from different data sources, different tables. For in this case, it might have queries these two fields from the user table and these post from the post table, and aggregate it and send the response back to the user in terms of a JSON object, which can be easily populated on the client. So that's the power of GraphQL, and it is quite fast. And there are three main operations. We already talked about query, so that is basically fetching the data from the GraphQL API, which corresponds to a GET request in REST. And then we have mutation. Mutation is nothing but changing the data, like creating, updating, deleting a record in the database. In REST, we use post, put, delete requests. But in GraphQL, we send a mutation. And then we have a subscription, so which is basically, watching over the changes of particular data. For example, let's say you do a mutation. Let's say you create a new post in the post table, and the clients can always listen onto the post creation mutation. So whenever a new post is added, the changes will pass on to the client in real time. So this is happening through WebSocket in GraphQL. So basically, client is opening up a WebSocket connection to the server, and whenever a mutation is happening, and if the client has a subscription onto that mutation, then it will receive the real-time data. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to GraphQL. So let's go to our demo. I'm opening up a terminal and navigate to desktop. and create a new directory called AppSync. And I will go into AppSync directory and I will open it in Visual Studio Code by typing code space period. So let's create our Angular application first. So I'm going to use Angular CLI. So I open up an integrated terminal here and I have installed Angular CLI, so I can type ng new my app, and I'm going to enable routing as well. So I have the latest Angular CLI and I will choose the styles as CSS, then start creating my application. Okay, we are going to create a very simple to-do application so that a user can log into the application and then create his or her to-dos. So in our application, I need two components. Let's cd into my app folder. The first component is auth. So I will use gc or the CLI generator to generate the component, and its name is auth. So this auth component, it will comprise of my login screen. And I'm going to use Amplify Auth UI component to integrate login, sign up, and all those screens very simply. So the next component is to do. So this is the component which contains my to-dos. Okay, both the components are created, and if I open my app folder and into the source folder and into the app folder, you should see those two components. So I'm going to set the routing as well. So I will go to app routing module and let's set two paths. Path to do, that will render the to do component, and another default path that render the auth component. So let's see if everything is working. I will type ng-serve. So when I open the application, it should render the default route, and you can see the auth works here. And these are the default content, which we are going to delete it right now. So here's the default content, and I will delete it. So I will have only the router component and save it. And here you go. So our default is auth route and it works. And if I go to to-do, the to-do works as well. So now we are going to add Amplify CLI and the Amplify library. So we can add a logging screen instead of this auth works. Okay. So let's stop the server and type npm install -d at AWS Amplify -CLI and hit enter. So this will install the Amplify CLI globally. CLI is installed, so now we can create resources in AWS like AppSync service. Now let's install AWS Amplify and AWS Amplify Angular. So these two libraries will allow us to talk to backend resources via the API. So in order to get these two libraries working, we have to do a small changes in our Angular application. The first one is adding a polyfill. So go to polyfill.ts and on top add this line of script. Windows as any global window, so this will provide a shim for the global object. And in index.html, inside the header tag, you need to add a script tag, and inside the script tag, add this line of code. If global is undefined, set the global to window. And now go to tsconfig.app.json file. Here's this file. And under types array, add node. Because Amplify will use node behind the scene, so we have to add the node type here. Okay, now let's use Amplify CLI to spin up resources. So let me clear the screen. So first we need to create a logging screen. We are going to create a Cognito user pool to hold our users and then allow them to access upon successful authentication. So let's enable authentication with Amplify by typing Amplify and first type help. So you will see all the commands. Now first of all, let's initialize a project even before adding the auth functionality. So I will type Amplify, hope you guys can see it, if not, Amplify init, hit enter. So this will initialize the Amplify project in AWS. So choose the default editor, in my case Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to build a JavaScript application which is an Angular, and our source directory is src because our directory name is src. Hit enter, and distribution directory is dist/myapp, which is the name of my app, and build command, hit enter and accept the default start command ng-serve. So now it asks whether or not I want to use an AWS profile. Now here I say yes, and I'm going to pick my YouTube profile. So if you guys have not configured an IAM profile in your machine, use Amplify configure and add your access key and secret access key with the name of a profile. Okay, now the project is initialized, so let's add auth. So here's the category auth. So in order to add that, let's type Amplify add auth. Select the default configuration. Now this is the default configuration of the user pool. Okay, it is added. Now before you pushing those changes to AWS, I'm going to add API as well. So I will type amplify add API and hit enter. So this time we are going to choose GraphQL API. So select GraphQL, not REST, and provide the API name. I will say my app. And the authorization type, choose Amazon Cognito user pool. Since we have already created a user pool, we can use authorization from that user pool. So Amazon Cognito user pool, and then it will ask, do you have an annotated GraphQL schema? In my case, I do not have anything, so I will say no and hit enter. Do you want a guided schema creation? Hit yes, and then it will ask some information about your project. So is it a one-to-many relationship, like blogs and posts, or single object with fields, like a to-do application, which exactly what we are building. So let's select single object with fields. And now it will ask, do I need to edit my schema right now? I will say yes and hit enter. It's going to open my schema.graphql. This is my GraphQL schema. So I'm going to change these attributes a little bit for my to-do. So ID is fine for a to-do, name is fine, and instead of description, I will type body. And also, I will have another attribute called completed, and that's a type of boolean. I will save it and come back to my editor and hit enter. Okay, it is created locally. Now, when I type Amplify publish or push, so what happens is Amplify will create my GraphQL API. So it will look at my schema definition. So this one, GraphQL schema, and it will create an AppSync service, and it will create a DynamoDB table with these fields, and also it will link that DynamoDB table with the AppSync service, and also add the necessary configuration to create, read, delete, update records in that table as well. So that's very convenient for us as a developer. So let's type amplify push, and it will ask these are the things or the resources that it's going to configure in cloud, the Auth, the Cognito user pool, and for the API, my app, AppSync API. So I will agree by typing yes and hit enter. So then it's going to ask me, do you want to generate code for the newly created GraphQL API? I will say yes, because I need the code for my Angular application. And then it will ask me, okay, give a path pattern to store all the queries, mutation, and subscription. I will accept the default because it's going to create this GraphQL folder inside my source directory and then add all those GraphQL files. So then it further suggests me, okay, now do you want to like create all those example operations like queries, mutations, and subscriptions as well? Of course, I need that. And now it's going to ask for a file to generate that code. I will accept the default, so that will create api.service.ts file. And now it's updating the resource. Now while it is updating, I wanted to attention on this particular directive. So this is the GraphQL schema, and it has this particular directive called @model. So there are multiple directives in Amplify. So @model is one of that. So in this directive, what it does is as soon as it shows, okay, this type with this directive, it's going to create a DynamoDB table with these attributes, and as I previously mentioned, it will do all this linking part with the AppSync service together with all the operations. So that's very cool. All right, it's created. You can see it has given me the GraphQL endpoint as well. So as you can see, it has created a lot of files here. Here the log says generated GraphQL operation successfully saved at source GraphQL folder. So let's see, this is our source folder and this is the GraphQL folder. And inside the GraphQL, you should see all the queries. And you see, we have a get to do query, get all the to dos like list to dos query, and then we have mutations like creating a to do, update and delete to do mutation, and also subscriptions as well. So we can subscribe to like on create to do. As soon as a to do is created, we can just listen for that and get the content. So apart from that, you should see there's this aws-export.js file, and it has all the configuration that Amplify has provision in my AWS account. So it has Cognito, user pool information, and also the GraphQL information, etc. Now we need to do one thing. So let's just take a copy of this file and paste it in the source directory again. And instead of .js file, I'm going to rename it as aws-export.ts file. Now we can import this file into our Angular components. Now let me show you one other thing. If you go to Amplify folder here and into the backend, into this API folder, and inside app folder you should see the build folder. Go inside that, then you should see this folder called resolvers. Now open it up. When you open it up, you should see there are multiple resolvers for creating to-dos and deleting to-dos, updating, getting, and listing to-dos. For each resolver, there's a request template. This is the request template for create to do, and this is the response template for creating to dos. And here's the request and response template for get to do. Now, what is this, guys? In GraphQL, when the browser sends a query to the API, let's say it's asking to get a particular to do, right? Then we have to write a resolver in order to do that operation. So if we want to get the to-dos, we have to query the DynamoDB table and get the corresponding to-do matching with the to-do ID, right? So we can do that in different ways. In GraphQL, we can have resolvers either by using the data source. For example, in this case, it is the DynamoDB. So we can use the DynamoDB get item operation. So you can see the operation is get item, and the key, this is the hash key or the primary key. So that is corresponding to the ID of the to-do. So this is the one of the options that you can write the resolvers. Or else you can write a lambda function and hook that as a resolver, and inside that lambda function you can talk to the DynamoDB and get the result and send it back to the client. So there are multiple ways that you can attach resolvers. So the request template is basically you are requesting the data from the data source, in this case DynamoDB, and the return data, you can like modify that return data back into a GraphQL response. So you can like restructure it as a GraphQL response. But if you want to do like further filtering before sending the response, you can add this here. So that's about getting to do. So how about creating to do? So that's a mutation. So when you send that mutation, you can again use DynamoDB operation, put item operation, and then for this new key, and add those attributes that is coming along through the mutation and create a new to-do item. And here also, instead of using this velocity template and using the DynamoDB put item operation, you can use a lambda function to talk to DynamoDB using DynamoDB SDKs and do that operation as well. Okay, so now let's add the Amplify login to our application. So in order to use Amplify, we have to do a little bit of configuration. So let's go to source folder and into our app and into app.module.ts, and we have to import some libraries. So what library do I have to import? I'm going to import Amplify service and Amplify Angular module from AWS Amplify Angular library. And I will add the module inside the imports here and the Amplify service as the provider. So now that we have the Amplify Angular module imported, we can use the UI component provided from the AWS Amplify Angular for authentication. So let's go to our auth component and go to auth component.html file. And here, instead of authworks, let me delete it and I will paste in the Amplify Authenticator directive. This will add all the UI components for login, logout, forget password, sign up, etc. But in order to do some styling, let's import Amplify styles into our styles.scss file. So I will go to styles.scss file, and here I'm going to import AWS Amplify Angular /theme.scss. Now let's see how our application looks by typing ngserve, and when we go to localhost 4200, yes, I should see this nice UI. So now let's add some code to our to-do component as well. I will remove this to-do works template and I will paste in this code. So there's this div, the wrapper div around. So inside that I have two buttons. First one is to create a to-do and the other one is to get all the to-dos. So create to-do is linked with the create to-do function. Get to-do is linked with get to-dos function. And then we have another div. This div will iterate over all the to-dos and print out the to-do name and the body and whether or not it is completed. I will upload this code into GitHub and link it so you guys can see it as well. Okay guys, let me change this get to do to list to dos because you are listing all the to dos here. And now let's create those functions. Let's go to our TS file and first one is create to do and list to dos. Now in order to create to do, I'm not going to use any like input boxes and get the actual to do content from the user, but instead I'm going to like generate a couple of to-dos when someone hit this button. So let me paste in this code. So const new to-do, and I have given the to-do name as to-do and then a random value between 1 to 100, and sample description, and this is the completed status, which is false. And now we have to use create to do mutation. So for that, let's use Amplify API. Now, before actually use Amplify, we haven't configured it properly. We got to do a small thing. So let's go to a main.ts file, which is our main Angular file that get bootstrapped. And there, we need to import Amplify from AWS Amplify library, like this. Import Amplify from AWS-Amplify. And then we have to import that AWS export file. If you can remember, guys, the Amplify generated this AWS export.js file, and we created this TS file. Of course, we can like use a script to do this conversion, but we'll like copy paste for now. So we are importing that particular export file as well. Then we are using amplify.configure and passing that particular export file. So that's it. So once you do this Amplify configure, Amplify know, okay, these are the resources that it can talks to, and these are the metadata that it can use. For example, AppSync URL. Let's do another thing. If you can remember, Amplify has created this API.service file. So this has all the mutations, queries, and subscription of AppSync. So we need to import this API service. If you want, you can put it to the app module as a provider, so you can use it throughout your components. But in my case, I will only use in the to-do component. So how can we use it? Let me go to to-do component, and on top, let me import that one directory up and API service, and I think that is called API service. Yeah. So let's import our service as well. And here in the constructor, let's create a private variable, call it API of API service. So now we can use this API private variable in order to talk to our AppSync endpoint. So let's go into our method, which is create to do. So we have this new to do, and in order to call this mutation, we have to use our API, this dot API dot, and it is create to do, and it will take the input as the to do input, which is nothing but our new to do. Let me just copy it and paste it in. Okay. Now this function is asynchronous function, guys, so we need to wait for that, and let's take the result into a variable called result. Why not? And since we are using await, we have to like create this function as a async function. All right, and let me just put a debug point here just to stop it at this point and inspect the result. And for list to dos, what do we need? Let's create another variable called all to dos. Then that is what we have referenced in our loop. Yes, it is all to dos. And let's call our API again, API dot list to dos. And you don't have to pass any parameters here. Again, we have to make this function async, and rather we'll define this all to dos on top. And here let's call it this dot all to dos. And on ng on init, so this is the function that called when this component is initialized. So let's call the same thing here as well. So when we refresh the page, it will always like call this function. And here also let's do another change. So once you have successfully created it, let's push that to do into our all to do list. This dot all to dos dot push the result. Okay. Let's see if it is compiling it all right. Yes, I think so. And I will go to localhost 4200, nothing. Let's inspect it. Process is not defined. I think there's another problem in Angular 6 where we need to use another shim for that. So let's go to polyfill.js. So in the polyfill.js, if you can remember, we had a polyfill for the global object, and also we need to have a polyfill for the process object. This is a workaround that I found on internet. So let's set this one window as any process, the script, and save it. And now let's do a refresh. There you go. Now it works. Now we are at localhost 4200. Okay, now this is our login page. Since you guys don't have any account created, you click create account and sign up for a new account with the username, password, and email, and those stuff. And afterwards you will receive an email to your email address with the confirmation code. Add that in, and then you are good to sign in. I have already created a user, so let me log in with him, mjson, and click sign in here. You should see the inspect element, the network tab, all the calls that it does for the backend. So it's calling the Cognito API. And once you are successfully signed in, Cognito will send you all the tokens, ID token, access token, and refresh token, and they will be stored in the local storage. So you can see it has grabbed my name, hello mjson, and let's go to to-do endpoint. Now that we are signed in, you can see our two buttons. Okay, we got an error. So let's see. Yeah, we need to define this as an array, all to-dos, and then here let's take this into a variable. Let result and assign this dot all to-dos as results dot items because there's this items attribute that these to-dos will be populated. Okay, and here also the same thing. Let me just copy these two lines, and when you click list to-dos, it will show that as well. Okay, I think now it looks good. Let's see. There you go. Now I have all these to-dos I created. So I got 9, 68, 18, and 78. Let's create another one. 88, and if I refresh it, yeah, I should get all those things right. And if you go to inspect element and into the network tab, let's inspect what happens when you click create to-dos. It's calling the GraphQL API and it's calling the create to-do mutation. So it is passing the body, completed or not, all that, right? Okay, so this is one of the ways that we can work with AppSync endpoint with Amplify GraphQL client. But this Amplify GraphQL client does not support offline functionality. So if you want offline functionalities and those complex features, you have to use AppSync SDK. But this GraphQL AppSync client is really great for handling mutations, queries, and subscription quite easily. All right, guys. So I'll see you in another video. Thanks.